Let us take one Java project and let us generate the documentation for a complete Java project using ChatGPT. So here I have a GitHub repository for library management system project. So this is a simple Java project using Spring Boot, Spring Data GPA and MySQL database. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate a documentation for this project. Okay. So let us open the source code of this project first and let us start with documenting the entity classes. So just open the book entity and just copy this code and let us ask ChatGPT to generate the documentation for this JPA entity. So go to the ChatGPT over here and here just add the prompt, add documentation for below JPA entity, and then just paste this code. Okay, and let us see how ChatGPT generate the documentation. And look at here, this is the documentation for this book class. And look at here, ChatGPT basically follows the industry standards. And this is the documentation for this field. Okay, so by looking into this documentation, any new developer can easily understand the code, isn't it? And notice here the explanation. ChatGPT not only document the code, it also provides the explanation about the documentation as well. Okay, next go to the project again, that is library management system, and go to entity. So similarly you can generate documentation for this user entity class. Next let us go to the repository and here go to book repository class and just copy this code. Next go to the ChatGPT over here and let us ask ChatGPT to generate the documentation for this book repository interface. So here just say add documentation for below JPA repository. So this is basically a Spring Data GPA repository. And then paste the repository code over here and then submit the prompt. And notice here ChatGPT basically added a documentation to this book repository. And if you look at the documentation over here, so this is the repository interface description, and you can see by default this repository provides methods for these operations. Okay, so by looking into this documentation you can easily understand the code. Okay, perfect. Next go to the project again and go to the IML package, go to service package, and here just open the book service file. Now let us add the documentation for this book service class as well. So here just copy this code, go to the ChatGPT again and let us ask ChatGPT to add the documentation for this book service class as well. So here just type add documentation for below book service class and just paste the code over here. And let us wait for the ChatGPT response. Well, in real-time project we basically add the documentation to the classes methods, right? So if you write the documentation manually, it takes a lot of time. So with the help of ChatGPT you can save a lot of time. You can just generate documentation like this. And notice here the response of the ChatGPT. Here is the documentation of book service class and its methods. So this is the documentation for this class, and you can see documentation for respective methods as well. So this is how we can ask ChatGPT to generate the documentation for a class and its methods. Next go to project again and go to the IML package and go to controller and let us ask ChatGPT to generate the documentation for book controller as well. So this book controller basically contains the REST APIs for book resource. So let us add the documentation for each REST API. So here just copy this code and go to the ChatGPT again and here let us say add documentation for below REST APIs, or let us say book controller, and just paste the code. And here we have a typo in the documentation, so just say documentation and then simply submit the prompt. So notice the ChatGPT response over here. Here is the detailed documentation for book controller class and its methods. So this is the documentation for this class, and here is the document for respective methods as well. And if you can notice the documentation for a REST API. So this is the description of the REST API. This is the description for the URL, and this is the description for the parameter. So basically ChatGPT follows the industry standards for documentation. So apart from adding documentation to the REST APIs like this, we can also ask ChatGPT to generate Swagger style documentation as well. So Swagger is one of the widely used library for documenting the REST APIs. So Swagger basically generates the UI that contains the documentation of the REST APIs. So we can ask ChatGPT to generate the Swagger style REST APIs. So ChatGPT will use all the Swagger related annotations to add the documentation. For instance, here just write the prompt, add Swagger style documentation to the below REST APIs, and just paste the code over here. Okay, next let us see how ChatGPT gives the response. Awesome, you can see here is the book controller class with Swagger style annotations added to the REST APIs. And if you can see the imports over here, these are the imports from Swagger library. And you can see ChatGPT added Swagger annotations like @tag, @operation, @API responses. This looks amazing, isn't it? We don't have to manually use the Swagger annotations and add the documentation. We can just ask ChatGPT. ChatGPT can do for us. Alright, and look at here, in a minutes we will get the documentation, that is Swagger style documentation for the REST APIs. If we write the documentation like this manually, it will take a lot of time, isn't it? So in order to save our time, we can ask ChatGPT to generate a documentation like this. And again, ChatGPT follows the industry standards. So this is how we can ask ChatGPT to generate the Swagger style documentation as well. Alright, so this is all about generating documentation with ChatGPT. Alright, great. I will see you in the next lecture.